The snow was still falling when the neighbors stepped outside. Drifts had swallowed fences whole. 3 barns had collapsed under the weight of the ice. A generator sputtered somewhere down the road, the only sound cutting through the silence of a landscape that had been beaten flat overnight. They walked toward the low structure at the edge of the field. Not to check on it, to confirm what they already assumed. It should have been gone. Everyone had said so. Months earlier, when the walls were going up, pale, packed, ridiculous, someone had called a hay pile with a door. Someone else had laughed and said the first hard frost would finish it. A few had simply shaken their heads and walked away, unwilling to waste breath on something so obviously doomed. But the structure was still standing. Not just standing, intact. No collapsed roof. No caved-in wall. No sign of the brutal 40-hour storm that had torn through the valley and left everything else in ruin. And from the narrow chimney at the peak, a thin thread of smoke rose steadily into the gray morning sky. Inside, a fire had been burning, slowly, quietly, all night long. That detail stopped them cold. Not the walls still standing. Not the roof still holding. The fire. Because in every other home on that road, people had been up feeding their stoves every 2 to 3 hours, burning through cord after cord of wood just to keep the temperature from dropping to dangerous levels. By morning, several had run short. Some had burned furniture. The man inside this straw structure had slept through the night. He used less than a third of the wood his neighbors burned. And his interior temperature, according to the simple thermometer hanging near the door, had barely moved. It had dropped fewer than 4 degrees Fahrenheit across the entire storm. Nobody could explain it. The walls were made of something that people throw away after harvest. The construction had taken one man and a handful of simple tools. There was nothing remarkable about it, at least nothing that anyone could see from the outside. But something inside those walls was working in a way that modern homes, with their fiberglass bats and their engineered lumber and their expensive heating systems, were not. The question is, what did this man understand that everyone else had missed? And why had it taken the worst blizzard in years to prove it? If you've ever been curious about what the old builders actually knew, and what we've forgotten, subscribe and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. This one goes deep. There are people who arrive in a place and immediately understand it, not through maps or surveys or the advice of locals, but through something quieter, through the way the wind moves in the morning, the direction the frost lingers longest, the angle at which the sun disappears behind a ridge in November. Caleb Morrow was that kind of man. He had come west in the early 1880s with little more than a worn leather satchel, a hand-drawn journal filled with sketches and measurements, and a conviction that the land could be lived on if a man was willing to listen to it. He was not a carpenter by trade. He was not a stonemason, nor a farmer in any formal sense. Oral accounts from the small settlement nearby describe him simply as a man who had traveled too far to care what other people thought. He had spent years moving through the upper Midwest and into the northern plains, working seasonal labor, observing how other settlers built their homes, and, more critically, observing how those homes failed. He had seen sod houses that breathed damp rot by spring. He had watched log cabins, proud and heavy, hemorrhage heat through gaps that no amount of chinking could permanently seal. He had sat inside timber-framed homes where the walls were thin and the wind came through as if the wood wasn't even there. He took notes. Always notes. By the time he staked his claim on a modest parcel in the valley, a flat, windswept stretch of land that no one else had wanted, he had already made his decision about materials. Not timber, not sod, not in the way others used it. Something that was everywhere, something the other settlers threw away without a second thought after every harvest. Straw, not hay, an important distinction he would make repeatedly to anyone who asked and to many who didn't. Hay retains moisture. Hay composts. Hay invites rodents and rot. Straw, the dry, hollow stalks left behind after the grain is separated, is an entirely different material. It is structural, is stable, and when compressed and stacked correctly, it traps air in a way that almost nothing else can match. He explained this to his nearest neighbors the first time they came to see what he was building. One of them, a veteran homesteader who had spent 2 decades on the plains, listened politely and then said, according to a local account recorded decades later, something to the effect of, "A man might as well sleep in a wheat sack and call a house." The others laughed. Caleb nodded and went back to work. What they didn't understand, what almost no one on that road understood in the autumn of 1882, was that Caleb wasn't building what they thought he was building. He wasn't stacking loose straw between posts and hoping for the best. He had spent months researching, sketching, calculating. He had spoken with European immigrants who had used compressed plant material for centuries in ways American settlers had never considered. He had read what little literature existed on thermal resistance and heat retention, translating its principles into something a single man with basic tools could actually build. He was not making a hay pile with a door. He was designing a thermal shell. But in the autumn of 1882, standing in a field with a stack of straw bales at his feet and the laughter of his neighbors still hanging in the cold air, none of that was visible. All anyone could see was the material, and the material, to every experienced eye on that road, looked like a mistake. The winter would answer them. But first, he had to build. To understand why Caleb chose what he chose, you have to understand the land he chose it on. The parcel sat at the edge of a broad, flat valley, the kind of terrain that looks generous from a distance but reveals its hostility the moment the season turns. There were no significant stands of timber within a reasonable hauling distance. The nearest sawmill was more than 30 miles away, and the road that connected them became impassable for weeks at a time once the heavy snow set in. Timber, the material every other settler on the plains defaulted to when sod failed them, was not a practical option. Not at scale. Not for a man working alone with limited capital. The soil itself offered some possibilities. There was clay in the lower sections of the property, decent material for daub and mortar, useful for finishing surfaces. But the ground was also rocky in patches, and the water table ran shallow enough that any serious excavation risked flooding. A root cellar was possible. A dugout was not. What the land did have, in abundance, in quantities that required no hauling and no purchase, was straw. The neighboring farms produced wheat and rye. After every harvest, the remaining stalks were gathered into bales, stacked briefly, and then either burned, composted, or left to rot. It was waste material, abundant, consistent, and free for the asking. Local accounts suggest that Caleb negotiated with at least 2 neighboring farmers to take their surplus bales off their hands, an arrangement that cost him almost nothing and provided him with more raw material than he needed. What most people failed to appreciate, and what Caleb had understood from his research, was the thermal property locked inside each individual straw stalk. Straw is hollow. Each stalk is essentially a sealed tube of air, and air, when trapped and unable to circulate, is one of the most effective thermal insulators known to basic physics. This is the same principle behind a down jacket, a double-pane window, or the fur of an Arctic animal. It is not the material itself that insulates, but the air that material holds still. When straw bales are compressed during baling, those individual air pockets are locked into a dense, stable matrix. The result is a wall section that can achieve an insulation value, what builders today measure as R value, of between R 30 and R 35 per standard bale laid flat. By comparison, a conventional timber frame wall filled with standard fiberglass insulation typically achieves somewhere between R 13 and R 21. Caleb did not have the vocabulary of R values. That terminology would not become standardized for decades. But he had something that served the same purpose: observation and arithmetic. He had noticed, in his years of traveling, that the coldest homes were always the thinnest ones. Not the smallest, the thinnest. A home with walls 8 inches thick and a good stove could still be brutal in January if the walls offered no resistance to the cold pressing in from outside. Conversely, he had visited a modest structure in Minnesota, built by a German immigrant using a technique that combined compressed plant material with a clay-lime render that held warmth for hours after the fire had gone cold. He had sketched that structure from every angle he could access. He had asked questions. He had taken measurements. And now, standing on a windswept parcel with no timber within reach and a winter already gathering on the horizon. He had everything he needed to build the same thing, and build it better. The land had not given him an easy choice. It had given him the only choice. And that constraint, as it turned out, was the most important decision the land could have made for him. He began staking the foundation in late September. The first hard frost came 3 weeks later. He kept working. Before a single bale went up, Caleb did something his neighbors would never have thought to do. He tested, not with laboratory instruments, he had none, but with the tools available to a careful observer. A thermometer, a small enclosed box he built from scrap wood, and several winter nights during which he packed that box with different materials and measured how long each one held warmth against the outside cold. He tested loose straw. He tested compressed straw. He tested clay. He tested combinations. The results aligned with what he had suspected from his earlier research. Compressed straw, sealed on all surfaces with a thin layer of clay-based render, outperformed every other option he had access to by a significant margin. What Caleb was discovering, empirically, without the benefit of formal terminology, was the concept of thermal resistance. Heat moves. That is the essential fact of any heating problem. It moves through solid materials by conduction, molecule to molecule, slowly but relentlessly. It moves through air by convection, warm air rising, cold air falling, carrying energy with it as it circulates. And it radiates outward from any warm surface toward any colder surface, like invisible light. Every wall, every ceiling, every floor of a structure is a battlefield where these three forces are constantly working to drag the interior temperature toward the exterior temperature. The only weapon against them is resistance. And resistance, in practical terms, means slowing down that movement as much as possible. This is where straw performs in a way that astonished even those who later studied it formally. A compressed straw bale wall, typically 18 to 24 inches thick in traditional construction, presents heat with an obstacle course. The compressed stocks create thousands of tiny air pockets, each one too small to allow convection to develop. Heat trying to conduct through the wall must travel through that dense, irregular matrix of plant fiber and trapped air, losing energy at every step. And because the outer surface is sealed with clay render, a material with its own modest thermal mass, the temperature gradient across the wall is spread over a much greater distance than a conventional framed wall would allow. In practical terms, the outside cold takes far longer to reach the inside. During Caleb's informal tests, a small enclosed space insulated with a 20-inch compressed straw wall held its interior temperature within 6 degrees Fahrenheit of its starting point for more than 9 hours after the heat source was removed, and outdoor temperatures hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit. A comparable enclosure built with a standard 6-inch timber wall, with minimal chinking, lost the same margin of warmth in under 2 hours. That difference, 9 hours versus 2, is not a comfort statistic. On the northern plains in January, it is the difference between waking up and not waking up. But there was a layer of misunderstanding that followed straw construction everywhere it appeared. It was the same misunderstanding that made Caleb's neighbors so confident in their ridicule. People confused straw with hay, and they confused loose straw with compressed straw. Loose, unbaled straw is indeed a poor building material. It compresses unevenly under load. It provides inconsistent insulation, and it can shift and settle in ways that create cold gaps inside the wall. It is also more vulnerable to moisture intrusion. Caleb had watched men try to build with loose straw and fail badly, and he understood precisely why they had failed. They had not understood that the compression was the key. The baling process, which in Caleb's era was done with mechanical balers that had recently become available across the plains, created a consistent, dense block with structural integrity that loose straw could never achieve. A standard bale from that period measured roughly 18 inches wide, 14 inches tall, and 36 inches long. Stacked on their flat sides, these bales created a wall nearly 18 inches thick before any render was applied. With 2 inches of clay-lime plaster on each face, the finished wall approached 22 inches of continuous insulation, with no studs, no gaps, No thermal bridges of any kind running from the cold outside to the warm inside. That last detail, the absence of thermal bridges, is something modern construction still struggles with. Every wooden stud in a conventional framed wall is a direct pathway for heat to escape. Lumber conducts heat roughly 40 times more efficiently than the insulation packed around it. In a typical framed wall, the studs alone can account for 15 to 20% of the total heat loss, even when the insulation between them is rated adequately. Caleb's walls had none of that. From the outer clay skin to the inner plaster, the only material heat had to fight through was compressed straw and trapped air. He wasn't building a hay pile with a door. He was building something that, by any modern thermal analysis, would qualify as a super-insulated structure, decades before that term existed, and constructed entirely from material his neighbors were burning as trash. The walls went up slowly. Each bale had to be carefully placed, leveled, and pinned. The work was methodical and unglamorous. And every evening, as Caleb smoothed another course of clay onto the growing wall, at least one neighbor would ride past on the road, slow down, look at the structure, and shake his head. He kept working. The foundation went in first. That much, at least, the neighbors understood. Caleb spent the better part of a week sourcing and setting flat fieldstone along the perimeter of his plant structure. He wasn't building deep. The water table wouldn't allow it, but he was building wide. Each stone was chosen for its flatness and density, dry stacked, and then mortared with a clay-lime mixture he prepared on-site from materials dug directly from the lower edge of his property. The finished foundation rose approximately 18 inches above the surrounding grade, creating a continuous stone platform that served two critical purposes. It lifted the base of the straw walls clear of ground moisture, and it provided a stable, level-bearing surface that would prevent the bales from shifting under the load of the structure above. This detail, the raised stone plinth, was not accidental. It was the product of direct observation. Caleb had seen straw and plant fiber construction fail at the base. Moisture wicking upward from damp soil could compromise a bale wall from the bottom in a single wet season, softening the compressed fiber, encouraging mold, and ultimately destroying the structural integrity of everything above. By elevating the first course of bales 18 inches off the ground and capping the stone with a thin layer of dense clay render, he created a moisture break that would protect the walls for decades. When the foundation was complete and level, he began laying bales. The technique he used is now recognized in vernacular building literature as the Nebraska-style method, though that name would not be formalized for many years after Caleb's construction. Bales were laid flat, on their largest face, stacked in a running bond pattern similar to bricklaying, with each bale offset from the one below it by roughly half a length. This staggered arrangement distributed load evenly across the wall and eliminated continuous vertical joints, the structural weak points where a wall can crack and separate under pressure. Each course was pinned to the one below it using sharpened wooden stakes driven vertically through the bales, a technique that prevented lateral shifting and kept the wall plumb as it rose. Caleb drove his stakes with a wooden mallet, working methodically around the perimeter, checking his lines with a plumb bob after every 3 courses. The walls rose to a height of approximately 8 feet at the eaves. Total bale count, based on the footprint of the structure and the standard bale dimensions of the period, would have been somewhere in the range of 280 to 320 bales, a volume that sounds enormous until you remember that the material cost him almost nothing. 2 neighboring farmers had allowed him to take their surplus harvest bales free of charge, grateful to have the disposal problem solved. Then came the rendering. This was the step that most observers misunderstood as purely cosmetic. It was not. The clay-lime plaster Caleb applied to both interior and exterior wall surfaces served 4 distinct functions simultaneously. First, it sealed the straw against moisture and air infiltration. Any gap in the plaster was a potential entry point for wind-driven moisture that could degrade the bales over time. Second, it added a layer of thermal mass to the surface of the wall. The dense clay skin absorbed heat slowly during the day and released it slowly at night, acting as a buffer against rapid temperature swings. Third, it bonded the individual bales into a monolithic wall system, dramatically increasing the structural rigidity of the entire assembly. And fourth, a detail that mattered enormously in the context of fire. It created a non-combustible outer shell that made the straw interior effectively inaccessible to flame. That last point was perhaps the most counterintuitive of all. Most people, looking at a straw wall, assumed it was a fire hazard. In reality, the opposite is closer to the truth. Loose straw burns readily, but compressed straw, dense enough that it cannot receive adequate oxygen, smolders rather than ignites when exposed to flame. Seal that compressed straw behind 2 inches of clay-lime plaster on each face, and you have a wall section that has been shown in later formal testing to resist direct flame exposure for well over an hour. None of this was visible from the road. From the road, what the neighbors saw was a low, rounded structure with thick walls and a slightly lumpy exterior, the natural result of hand-applied plaster over an irregular bale surface. It looked to their eyes unfinished, imprecise, primitive. One man, a skilled carpenter who had framed several proper timber homes in the area, rode past during the rendering stage and called out that Caleb had built himself a mud-covered haystack. He meant it as an insult. He was not entirely wrong about the description. He was entirely wrong about what it meant. Caleb kept his hands in the clay and said nothing. By the time the first light snow dusted the valley floor in late October, the walls were complete. The roof framing, a simple reciprocal structure of heavy timber poles, covered with a layer of split shingles and a thick sod cap, sat solidly atop the finished bale walls, its weight pressing down on the straw and increasing the compression of the bales still further. The additional compression was not incidental. It was engineered. More compression meant denser air pockets. Denser air pockets meant higher thermal resistance, and higher thermal resistance meant more warmth retained per unit of firewood burned. From the outside, the cabin looked modest to the point of absurdity. From the inside, it was already warmer than any structure of comparable size on that road. The neighbors didn't know that yet. They would find out in February. A wall, no matter how well insulated, is only part of the story. Caleb understood something that even experienced builders of his era frequently overlooked. A structure is a system. Every component interacts with every other component. The weakest thermal link in the chain, a thin door, an uninsulated ceiling, a gap around a window frame, can negate a significant portion of the work done by the best walls in the world. Heat does not respect effort. It finds the easiest path available and flows through it without hesitation. This is why Caleb spent nearly as much time thinking about the details of his structure as he spent building the main walls. The first critical detail was the entry. In a conventional cabin of the period, the front door opened directly from the exterior into the main living space. This arrangement was standard, practical, and thermally disastrous. Every time the door opened in winter, a column of cold air rolled in across the floor, while warm interior air rushed out overhead, a convective exchange that could drop the interior temperature by several degrees in a matter of seconds, and that repeated itself dozens of times a day. In a thin-walled cabin with a modest stove, this constant cycling was a significant fraction of the total heat load. Caleb built what would now be called an airlock entry, a small enclosed vestibule, approximately 4 feet deep and the full width of the door, positioned between the exterior door and the interior door. The outer door opened into this vestibule. The inner door opened from the vestibule into the main living space. The 2 doors were never opened simultaneously. The vestibule itself was insulated, bale walls on 3 sides, thick door on each end, and it created a thermal buffer zone between the brutal outside air and the carefully maintained interior environment. The principle is identical to what modern passive house designers call a thermal lock or cold porch. It is a feature found in traditional Arctic building, in Scandinavian farm architecture, in the earthen lodges of the Great Plains tribes who had developed it generations before any European settler arrived. Caleb had encountered the concept in his travels. He noted in one of his journal sketches, reproduced in a local historical collection, a rough drawing labeled simply double door keeps the cold outside where it belongs. The second critical detail was the ceiling. Heat rises. Every homesteader on the plains knew this as a practical matter. The floor was always the coldest part of the room, but few had thought carefully about what it meant for the ceiling. In a standard single-room cabin with a low ceiling, the warmest air in the building pressed directly against the roof structure. If that roof structure was thin, poorly sealed, or uninsulated, the warmest air in the cabin was in constant contact with the coldest surface in the structure. The result was a continuous, invisible drain on every BTU the stove produced. Caleb addressed this in two ways. First, he laid a thick bed of loose straw, 14 to 16 inches, directly on top of the interior ceiling boards before the roof framing and sod cap were installed. This created an insulating layer above the living space that rivaled the thermal resistance of the bale walls themselves. Second, he finished the sod cap on the exterior roof surface with a dense, compressed layer of clay-heavy sod, approximately 8 inches thick, that added thermal mass to the roof assembly, slowing the rate at which exterior cold could penetrate downward even during extended cold snaps when no sun was available to warm the outer surface. The combined effect of the insulated ceiling and the sod cap was a roof assembly that performed, thermally, far beyond anything its simple material suggested. Local oral accounts from a later decade, collected by a regional historical society, describe visitors to the cabin being struck by how the temperature near the ceiling, typically the warmest point in any heated room, never seemed to be dramatically higher than the temperature at floor level. This thermal evenness is a hallmark of a well-insulated envelope. When the walls, ceiling, and floor are all performing adequately, there is nowhere for the warm air to pile up and nowhere for cold air to pool. The room simply stays warm. The third critical detail was the stove placement. Caleb positioned his small cast-iron stove not against an exterior wall, as was common practice, for the convenience of running a short flue directly through the wall, but near the center of the single main room, with the flue rising vertically through the roof at a point as close to the roof's thermal center as practical. This arrangement meant that the stovepipe, which radiated significant heat along its entire length while in operation, was releasing that radiant heat into the interior space rather than through an exterior wall where it would be partially lost to the outside. It also meant that the fire's heat could radiate in all directions from the center of the room, reaching the walls more evenly and reducing the temperature differential between the warm core of the space and the cooler perimeter. Taken individually, none of these details was revolutionary. The airlock entry, the insulated ceiling, the centered stove, each one was a known technique, borrowed from building traditions that Caleb had observed and recorded during his years of travel. What made Caleb's structure remarkable was not the invention of any single element, but the integration of all of them into a coherent thermal system, designed from the ground up to minimize heat loss at every point simultaneously. The walls held the cold out. The ceiling held the warmth in. The entry prevented the exchange. The stove heated the center. The mass of the clay render and the sod cap absorbed excess heat during firing and released it slowly during the long hours between fires. Each piece supported every other piece. From the outside, the cabin looked like a rough mound of clay and straw. From the inside, it functioned like a carefully engineered thermal vessel, built by one man, with free materials, using tools that fit in a single satchel. The winter had not arrived yet, but the trap was set. The first warning came as a shift in pressure. Caleb had been on the plains long enough to read weather the way other men read print. The particular quality of the light on the afternoon of January 14th, a flat, yellowish cast that seemed to drain the color from the snow-covered fields, told him what the barometer confirmed when he checked it that evening. Something large was coming. Something that had been building for days over the upper territories, gathering cold and momentum as it moved south and east, would reach the valley within hours. He spent what remained of the daylight preparing. He brought in wood, enough for 3 days, stacked tight against the interior wall beside the stove. He checked the door seals on both the outer and inner vestibule doors, pressing fresh clay fiber rope into any gap he could find. He banked the stove carefully, loading it with dense hardwood chunks that would burn slowly and steadily rather than hot and fast. He filled the 2 ceramic water vessels he kept near the stove and moved them closer to the heat. Then he closed the inner door, latched it, and sat down. By midnight, The storm had arrived in full. The wind came first, not as a gust, but as a sustained, low-frequency roar that pressed against the exterior walls with a force that rattled the small shuttered window and drove fine snow crystals through the outer door's latch gap into the vestibule. Temperatures outside, which had already been sitting at a dangerous 4 degrees Fahrenheit at sundown, were dropping fast. By the early hours of January 15th, the thermometer mounted on the exterior of the vestibule, sheltered from direct wind, reading ambient air temperature, had fallen to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill in the open field surrounding the cabin was producing conditions that experienced plainsmen would later describe, in collected accounts, as among the most severe they had encountered in decades on that land. The storm would continue for 40 hours. Across the valley, the situation deteriorated quickly. In the timber frame homes along the road, structures built to the standards of the time, with 4 to 6 inch log walls or sawn lumber frames filled with whatever insulating material had been available. The battle against the cold began in earnest within the first few hours. Stoves were loaded and reloaded. Families moved children away from exterior walls, away from windows, toward the center of rooms. Gaps that had been tolerable in October revealed themselves as serious liabilities in January. Cold air streamed in at baseboard level, at window frames, at door thresholds. One family, whose account was recorded years later, described waking every 90 minutes through the night to reload their stove and still watching their interior temperature fall to 38 degrees Fahrenheit by early morning, cold enough to freeze water left on the floor near the walls. Several homes ran short of wood before the storm broke. In at least 2 cases, furniture was burned to maintain a survivable temperature. Inside Caleb's straw cabin, the situation was different in a way that is difficult to fully convey without understanding the physics already described. The bale walls, 22 inches of compressed straw and clay render in every direction, were doing what Caleb had calculated they would do. The exterior cold, pressing in at minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, was being forced to conduct its way through more than 20 inches of one of the most thermally resistant materials available on the plains. The rate of heat loss through the walls was a fraction of what a conventional cabin would have experienced. The insulated ceiling above, with its 14-inch straw layer and sod cap, was holding the warm air in. The airlock entry was preventing the convective exchange that cost other homes so much warmth every time a door opened. Caleb loaded his stove twice during the night. Twice. Not every 90 minutes. Not every 3 hours. Twice across the entire 40-hour storm, with a longer reload on the second day when the wind was at its worst and he needed to maintain temperature more aggressively. His total wood consumption for the duration of the storm, based on his own journal notation, was approximately 1/3 of a standard cord. Neighboring homesteads of comparable size burned between 3/4 and a full cord over the same period, with some reporting that it still wasn't enough. The interior temperature of the straw cabin, measured at the thermometer hanging near the inner door, ranged between 61 degrees Fahrenheit and 65 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the storm. At no point during the 40-hour event did the temperature inside the cabin fall below 59 degrees Fahrenheit, even during the hours between stove loadings when no active fire was producing heat. The walls were doing the work. The mass was holding. The system was performing exactly as designed. Caleb slept, not fitfully, not in anxious intervals. He slept, according to the matter-of-fact tone of his own journal entry for that night, without particular interruption. He had built a thing that worked. There was nothing left to worry about. Outside, the storm tore across the valley for another day and a half. Inside, a small stove ticked quietly in the corner, and a thin man slept under a wool blanket while the worst blizzard in years spent itself against 22 inches of straw and clay. There is a particular quality to silence inside a well-built structure during a violent storm. It is not the absence of sound. The wind is still there. You can hear it, low and persistent, pressing against the outer skin of the building like something alive and insistent. But it is muffled, softened, reduced from a roar to a murmur by the sheer mass of material standing between you and it. The sound arrives at your ears, already tired, already spent, having given up most of its energy to the walls before it could reach you. Caleb noted this in his journal, not in dramatic terms. He was not a dramatic writer, but with the quiet precision of a man who had expected a result and was recording its confirmation. The entry for the night of January 14th reads, in part, as reconstructed from a transcription held in a regional historical collection. Wind considerable. Wall hold sound well. Interior warm. Stove not requiring attention. That last phrase, stove not requiring attention, is the detail that matters most. In the homes along the road outside, the stove was the center of every waking moment that night. It demanded fuel every hour to hour and a half as the thin walls bled heat into the darkness. Families organized themselves around in shifts. Children were kept close to it. Everything else, sleep, comfort, ordinary life, was subordinated to the single overriding task of keeping the fire fed and the interior temperature above the threshold where pipes freeze and bodies begin to fail. Inside the straw cabin, the stove was a secondary concern. This inversion, the fire serving the occupant rather than the occupant serving the fire, was not a luxury. It was the entire point of the design. Every joule of heat that escaped through a thin wall had to be replaced by burning more wood. Every degree the interior dropped between firings had to be clawed back at the cost of more fuel, more labor, more risk. A structure that lost heat slowly was a structure that gave its occupant freedom. Freedom to sleep, to rest, to think about something other than survival. The interior temperature at the time of Caleb's final journal entry for that night, written, by his own notation, near midnight, was 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the thermometer in the vestibule read minus 19 degrees Fahrenheit. The differential between inside and outside was 82 degrees Fahrenheit. The walls were holding that differential with a single stove load, slowly cooling toward its next firing cycle. By any standard of frontier construction, this was an extraordinary performance. To understand why it was possible, it helps to think about what was happening inside the bale walls themselves during that night. The exterior surface of the clay render, exposed to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit air and wind-driven snow, was cold. Extremely cold. But that cold was not simply walking through the wall. It was being forced to conduct inward through 20-plus inches of compressed straw and trapped air, a process that proceeded at a rate far slower than most people intuitively expect. Thermal conductivity is measured as the rate at which heat moves through a material of given thickness under a given temperature differential. Compressed straw has a thermal conductivity value of approximately 0.052 watts per meter Kelvin, roughly comparable to expanded polystyrene foam and dramatically lower than timber, stone, or brick. What this means in practice is that even with an 82 degrees Fahrenheit differential between inside and outside, the cold was advancing through those walls at a pace measured in hours, not minutes. By the time the exterior cold had conducted its way halfway through the baled depth, the interior half of the wall was still warm, still giving back the heat it had absorbed during the day's firing, acting as a slow-release thermal reservoir. This is the mechanism that allowed Caleb to sleep. It was not magic. It was not luck. It was compressed straw, trapped air, and a wall thick enough to make time work in the occupant's favor rather than against him. He woke once during the night. His journal notes rose briefly, checked stove, banked fire, returned to sleep. The interior temperature at that point, by his reading, was 59 degrees Fahrenheit. He added 2 pieces of dense hardwood, adjusted the damper to a slow burn, and went back to his blanket. By morning, when the storm was still raging outside and the thermometer in the vestibule had fallen to its lowest recorded point of minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior had recovered to 62 degrees Fahrenheit without any additional intervention. Meanwhile, on the road outside, at least 3 families had not slept at all. The contrast was not lost on Caleb, but he did not write about his neighbors that night. He wrote about the walls, about the sound they made, or rather, the sound they absorbed, about the particular quality of the warmth inside a structure that was genuinely insulated rather than merely heated. He wrote that the air felt even, his word, throughout the space. Not hot near the stove and cold at the floor. not warm in the center and frigid at the walls. Even. That evenness is the signature of a thermal envelope that is working as a complete system. When the walls, ceiling, and floor are all performing adequately, there are no cold zones for the warmth to flee toward. The heat stays where it is produced. The room holds its temperature not because the fire is large, but because there is nowhere for the warmth to go. Caleb had built a room that held warmth the way a good clay pot holds water. Not perfectly, not forever, but far longer and with far less loss than a vessel full of holes. Outside, the blizzard reached its peak intensity sometime in the early hours of January 15th. Wind speeds in the open valley likely exceeded 55 miles per hour based on the damage assessments recorded by local accounts in the days following the storm. Snow was horizontal. Visibility was zero. The cold was the kind that kills livestock in hours and frostbites expose skin in minutes. Inside the straw cabin, a thin man slept under a wool blanket. The stove ticked. The walls held. The night passed. The storm broke sometime before noon on January 16th. The wind dropped first. Not suddenly, but in stages, as if the thing that had been pressing against the valley for 40 hours was simply running out of force. By early afternoon, the sky had shifted from the uniform gray of the blizzard to a sharper, colder blue, the kind that comes when the air is completely clear of moisture and the temperature has nowhere left to fall. The snow on the ground had drifted to depths of 4 and 5 feet in the low points of the fields. Fence lines had disappeared. The road that connected the homesteads along the valley was buried under a continuous drift that would take days to make passable. The neighbors emerged slowly. They came out to assess damage, to check on livestock, to begin the long labor of digging out. Several were visibly exhausted. The toll of a sleepless night, feeding stoves, and keeping children warm was written plainly on their faces. At least 2 households had burned furniture during the night. One family reported that their interior temperature had fallen to 34 degrees Fahrenheit near the exterior walls before morning, cold enough that the water in their kitchen vessel had developed a thin skin of ice. At some point during that afternoon, a small group of them made their way down the snow-packed path toward Caleb's structure at the edge of the field. They came, most of them, with the quiet demeanor of people who had already begun to revise their expectations. The cabin was standing. That much had been visible from the road. The roof was intact. No walls had shifted or collapsed. The chimney, a simple clay-lined flue rising from the center of the roof, had a faint wisp of smoke curling from its top, evidence that the stove inside was still operating on residual heat rather than active firing. Caleb opened the inner vestibule door when he heard them at the outer door. What happened in the next few minutes was recorded in multiple oral accounts, collected by a regional historical society in the decades following the event, and the details are consistent enough to treat as reliable reconstruction. One of the visitors, the same carpenter who had called the structure a mud-covered haystack during construction, stepped through the airlock entry and into the main room. He stopped. He stood for a moment without speaking. Then he asked Caleb what temperature it was inside. Caleb pointed to the thermometer near the door. It read 61 degrees Fahrenheit. The carpenter looked at it for a long moment. Then he asked how much wood Caleb had burned during the storm. Caleb showed him the woodpile. He had started with a 3-day supply stacked against the interior wall. After 40 hours of the worst blizzard in recent memory, he had used approximately 1/3 of what remained. His total consumption for the duration of the event was, by his own journal estimate, just under 1/3 of a standard cord, roughly 40 to 45 cubic feet of split hardwood. The carpenter had burned through more than twice that amount, and his interior temperature had still dropped to dangerous levels overnight. The numbers required no commentary. To make them concrete, a standard timber frame cabin of the period, with 4 to 6-inch log walls and minimal chinking, loses heat through its wall assembly at a rate that, in conditions equivalent to the January 14th blizzard, with an 80 degrees Fahrenheit differential between inside and outside, requires approximately 12,000 to 15,000 BTUs per hour just to maintain a temperature of 60 degrees Fahrenheit. A small cast iron stove of the period burning dense hardwood at a moderate rate, produces roughly 20,000 to 25,000 BTUs per hour at peak output, meaning that in those conditions, the stove is barely keeping pace with the wall losses, and any reduction in firing rate results in a rapid temperature drop. Caleb's straw walls, with their dramatically lower thermal conductivity, reduced the heat loss rate through the wall assembly to an estimated 3,500 to 4,500 BTUs per hour under the same conditions. The same stove, burning at a fraction of its capacity, was producing 4 to 5 times more heat than the walls were losing. The excess heat was being absorbed by the thermal mass of the clay render surfaces and the packed straw itself, stored and released slowly during the hours between firings. This is why the interior temperature barely moved while the fire was low. The walls were giving back what they had stored. The visitors stood in the room and felt the warmth and looked at the wood pile and said very little for a while. The carpenter, by the account most consistently reported across multiple oral histories, eventually said something to the effect of, "I don't understand how this is possible." It was not said with hostility. It was said with the genuine bewilderment of an experienced builder encountering a result that his entire framework of understanding had not prepared him for. He had spent years working with timber. He knew how timber behaved. He had never seriously considered that the material his neighbors threw away after harvest could outperform every conventional option available to him. Caleb, by all accounts, was not unkind in his response. He offered the carpenter a chair. He put a pot on the stove. And then, unhurried, he began to explain. He talked about the air trapped in the straw stalks. He talked about the thickness of the walls and what thickness meant for the rate of heat transfer. He talked about the clay render and the way its mass absorbed and released heat on a delay. He talked about the airlock entry and the insulated ceiling. He explained, in the plain language of a man who had spent years turning observation into understanding, why each element of the structure worked the way it did. The carpenter listened. He asked questions. He looked at the walls, really looked at them, pressing his palm flat against the interior plaster surface and feeling the faint warmth stored in the clay. And something shifted in his expression. He was not the last man on that road to revise his opinion of Caleb's straw cabin, but he was the first. Caleb had not invented anything. This is the detail that complicates the story, and also the detail that makes it most interesting. The techniques he used, the principles he applied, the materials he chose. None of them were original to him. They were old. In some cases, they were ancient. What Caleb had done was not invent a new method, but recover a set of practices that had been quietly set aside as the industrialization of construction swept across North America in the second half of the 19th century. The use of plant fiber as a primary building material has roots that extend far deeper than the American frontier. In Northern and Central Europe, builders have been incorporating straw, reed, and compressed grass into wall and roof assemblies for centuries. The half-timbered structures of medieval Germany and England, the kind of buildings that still stand today in preserved villages, often used a clay straw composite called wattle and daub to fill the spaces between their timber frames. The straw in that mixture was not decorative and not structural in the modern sense. It was thermal. It was fiber that held the clay together, prevented cracking during drying, and increased the insulative value of the finished wall panel beyond what plain clay could achieve. In Scandinavia and Iceland, builders working with even more severe winters had developed techniques for incorporating compressed turf, densely packed plant material, and layered earth into roof and wall assemblies that could maintain interior temperatures far above what the exterior conditions would suggest was possible. The Norse longhouse, a structure that housed both people and livestock through winters that make the American plains look moderate, used a combination of earth berming, turf roofing, and animal body heat in a deliberately integrated thermal system that had been refined over generations of cold weather observation. In Japan, the traditional irori, a central hearth sunk into the floor of the main living space, combined with the shoji screen system and thick tatama floor mats to create a thermal environment that concentrated heat at the occupied level of the room while allowing the structure itself to breathe and flex. The principle of bringing the heat source to the center of the space, rather than pushing it against an exterior wall, was one that Caleb had independently arrived at through his own observation, and that Japanese builders had codified into architectural tradition centuries earlier. On the North American continent, the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains had developed thermal building strategies that European settlers largely failed to appreciate or adopt. The earth lodge of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara peoples, a structure built partially below grade, with walls of packed earth and timber, and a roof of layered grass and sod, achieved interior temperatures that remained habitable through the harshest plains winters with a fraction of the fuel consumption of a comparable European-style cabin. The semi-subterranean design used the earth itself as thermal mass and insulator, taking advantage of the fact that soil temperature at a depth of 4 to 6 feet remains relatively constant year-round, typically between 45 degrees Fahrenheit and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the surface temperature is doing. These builders, Norse, Japanese, Mandan, German, Icelandic, were not working from theoretical physics. They were working from generations of accumulated observation, refined through the unforgiving feedback of cold winters and the basic human need to stay warm without burning everything they owned. The physics was the same physics Caleb understood. The implementation had simply been developed long before any of its practitioners had the vocabulary to describe it in formal terms. What happened in the mid to late 19th century, as industrial lumber production made sawn timber cheap and widely available, was a mass replacement of these accumulated vernacular practices with a single standardized approach, the light wood frame. Fast to build, easy to modify, compatible with machine-cut lumber and industrial fasteners. The balloon frame and later the platform frame became the dominant construction method across North America with remarkable speed. The old ways, the earth berming, the compressed plant fiber, the thick clay render walls, were not disproven. They were simply bypassed. The industry moved on, and the knowledge began to fade. By the time Caleb was building his straw cabin in 1882, the methods he was using were already being forgotten by the mainstream building culture around him. His neighbors, most of whom had grown up in a world of timber frame construction, had no framework for evaluating what he was doing. They did not know what they did not know. This is the most important lesson buried inside Caleb's story. The failure was not technical. The techniques worked, they had always worked, and they worked demonstrably when the blizzard arrived to settle the question. The failure was institutional. It was the failure to carry knowledge forward, to treat vernacular building wisdom as a resource worth preserving rather than a primitive habit worth replacing. The blizzard of January 1882 did not prove that straw was better than timber in every conceivable situation. It proved that thickness mattered, that thermal mass mattered, that the integration of structure's components into a coherent system mattered, and that these truths did not become less true simply because the culture around them had moved on to other materials. What Caleb understood, the builders of the past had understood before him. What they all understood, together, was something that the construction industry of the late 19th century, and in many ways the construction industry of the 21st century, had not yet fully absorbed. Warmth is not produced. It is retained, and retention is a function of design, not of expense. The straw cabin stood for longer than anyone who laughed at it would have predicted. Local accounts, assembled from property records and the recollections of descendants of neighboring families, suggest that the structure remained in use for at least 2 decades after its construction. A later inspection, conducted by a builder who had heard the story of the January blizzard and traveled to the valley to examine the cabin firsthand, reportedly found the bale walls in sound condition, with no significant moisture intrusion at the base and only minor cracking in the exterior render at points where the clay-lime mixture had been applied too thinly during the original construction. The repairs required, by his description, were modest: a fresh skim coat of clay plaster on the affected sections, a resealing of the door thresholds, and a new layer of sod on a small section of the roof where a bird had worked a gap into the turf cap. For a structure built by one man, from free materials, in a single season, it had performed beyond any reasonable expectation the skeptics of 1881 would have assigned it. What happened to that knowledge in the century that followed is a more complicated story. Straw bale construction did not disappear after the frontier era. In Nebraska, the state most closely associated with the techniques American development, and the origin of the Nebraska-style, name later given to load-bearing bale construction. A number of structures built during the late 19th and early 20th centuries survived well into the modern era. The Pilgrim Holiness Church in Arthur, Nebraska, built in 1928 from straw bales and still standing today, is perhaps the most cited example. A load-bearing bale structure that has endured nearly a century of plains weather and remains in active use. It is not a curiosity. It is a functioning building, and its survival is a data point that the construction industry has been slow to fully reckon with. The formal revival of straw bale construction as a recognized building method began quietly in the 1970s and accelerated through the 1980s and 1990s, driven in part by the energy crisis of the preceding decade, and in part by a growing community of builders and researchers who had rediscovered what Caleb and his predecessors had known. Academic studies conducted during this period, including thermal performance testing of actual bale wall assemblies under controlled conditions, confirmed R values in the range of R30 to R38 for standard bale walls, depending on bale density, orientation, and render type. These numbers placed straw bale construction firmly in the category of super-insulated building, competitive with or exceeding the performance of spray foam insulation at a fraction of the embodied energy and material cost. Today, straw bale construction is a recognized method in the building codes of several U.S. states, including California, which adopted straw bale provisions in its residential code in 2015. Certified passive house structures have been built using straw bale walls in Europe, North America, and Australia. Architects working in the high-performance building sector have published peer-reviewed research on the material's thermal, acoustic, and carbon sequestration properties. Straw, unlike concrete or steel, stores carbon rather than emitting it during production, making a straw bale wall one of the few building assemblies that is net carbon negative from the moment of its construction. None of this would have surprised Caleb. He was not a man given to vindication. His journal entries in the weeks following the January blizzard are not triumphant. They are practical. Notes on repairs needed, observations about how the structure had performed, thoughts on what he would do differently in a second building. He recorded the visits from neighbors, including the carpenter, without embellishment. He noted that several people had asked him questions about the construction methods, and that he had answered them as fully as he could. What he wrote on the last page of that particular journal volume, again reconstructed for the transcription held in the Regional Historical Collection, was not about straw or clay or thermal mass. It was something simpler. He wrote that the most expensive thing a man can build is a house that wastes heat, and that the cheapest thing a man can build, if he is willing to think carefully and work patiently, is a house that holds it. That sentence was written in the winter of 1882 by a man sitting inside a straw cabin while his neighbors dug out from the worst blizzard in years. It has not become less true since. The construction industry has given us remarkable tools in the century and a half that separates us from Caleb's Valley. Engineered lumber, spray foam, thermal imaging, blower door tests, passive house certification, heat pump technology. These are genuine advances, and they matter. But the underlying principle, that warmth is retained, not produced, and that retention is a function of design, remains exactly what it was when Caleb stacked his first bale on a stone foundation in the autumn of 1881. The old builders knew this. The best modern builders know it too. The same question that stood unanswered for the neighbors walking toward that smoke-trailing chimney on the morning of January 16th, is not whether the knowledge exists. The question is whether we are willing to use it. If this story made you think differently about what a wall is actually doing, what it was built to do, share it with someone who builds things or someone who wants to. And if you haven't already, subscribe and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. The next story goes just as deep. This content is historical and educational in nature. It does not substitute for licensed engineering, building codes, or professional construction guidance.